This month's block of the month is Drunkards Path. As you can see, it's going to be two different colors. We're going to cut out cream colored, and we're going to cut out a non-cream colored or non-white also. Try not to make this a lighter color, whichever one you pick from your stash, if you're making it from your stash. I'm going to show you templates because when I sent out the information, templates were included. But I wanted to show you a few different layouts for this Drunkards Path. If you use the cream as your background, then you can make it your defined portion of your quilt. It can be put into several different structures. This one is if you are using white as your circle versus the last one where you're using cream as your background and circle. So this one is totally, the circle is white. This one is a mixture. Some of the circles are white, some of the circles are color. In this month's blocks, we're going to make something similar to this or similar to this, because this one has backgrounds that have color and this one has circles that have color. Here is an example on my wall of something I've made. Now, they're in different sizes, and I'm going to be cutting all of the Drunkards Paths I get to a smaller size. So make sure when you make your Drunkards Path that you don't sew them together, because I'm going to be cutting them down and sewing them together. The tools we're going to use today are ruler or template to cut out your fabric, rotary cutter to cut out with the ruler. I use a Friction dark pen or a chalk marker to mark my fabrics with the templates. A pair of scissors to cut out your fabric if you go with the template or when you go with the template, and to cut out the easement lines when you go with the template. And if you do the glue method, stick glue. If you do the non-glue method, then pins. And a third option you can use is starch, but I'm just going to give you a little bit on that at the end of this program. For the size that I'm making, I'm starting out with 7.5-inch blocks in a cream and in a color. The tools I'm going to use to make this, because I'm going to be using a ruler I purchased, and I would suggest if you're going to do this project as a big quilt, you want to get a ruler, maybe not this one, but this one does all different size corner circles, half circles, or whole circles. So I figured I can use this for more than just this project. It also gives it to you in half size, so all the way from 3.5 to 15.5, or whole size, 15 all the way from 3 to 15 inch. When making this project, I had a hard time matching the ruler to my EQ pattern, but I've got it semi-close. Using a template is your least expensive way to work on this project. But I would suggest not only do you cut a template out for cutting your pieces, where you're drawing your template onto the back of your fabric to cut out, but you also cut a second template out that doesn't have any seam allowance on the circular side, on the curved side. Reason for this is marking your lines. So if you see on this cream color, I have my lines marked. I have my circle side, quarter circle side actually, and I have my background. So I'm going to call this the upper and the lower. I have the upper and the lower both drawn. But what I also did was I came back and I put my seams in so that when I sew them together, it's easier. Also, so that I know exactly how far to clip into my object to make my easements. And if you structure your templates, these extra templates, with your lines, it makes it quicker and easier to add the lines in. Now, you can add the lines in by drawing them like I have on this piece, or after you've cut out your pattern from the fabric with the seam allowance, you can come back and use your scissors and clip, 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 clip. Like I said, you'll know how far to clip in because you already have the line drawn for your seam. So that's a tip for you about if you're doing these by template and you want to do them faster, then there you go. And then here's a tip. When you put your two patterns together that have no seams, you can draw your seam easement lines as one line, so you know you're getting them in exactly the same place when you're cutting your easements on two different patterns, pieces, two different pattern pieces. So on this one, I am doing two different size lines because on one demonstration, I'm going to be using these outer lines, these bigger lines first. On another demonstration, I'm going to be using smaller lines as well. When you are sewing together without glue, you need to cut all of these lines. When you are sewing together with glue, you can skip these short lines when you're cutting your easements. And I will show you how and why in just a minute. Traditionally, when you would sew these before we had any other methods, then you would make easements all along your seam line, and you would match up each one of those easements to get your line to be nice and even, so that when you came back you had something that came out like this. Here's all my easements. That way you can get your line nice and curved and all of your fabric eased in nicely. I did this without any glue. I only pinned it and then I sewed it together using the line, which in the past you wouldn't have used the line. You would have just used your 1/4 inch marker on your machine. And it looks pretty good. And you can do that. That's a lot of work. So on the method that I like to do, I'm going to use glue to baste the seam together. So here's the easements and the front and the back. You'll flip it this way and you'll take and you'll glue the two sides together first. So when you're gluing this, here's a side, and then here's the other side. Now, the next thing I do is I take the center easement and glue it together, both sides. That way I have 3 stable areas that are glued together. Then I go back and I glue each section to each other in between. And when I'm done, I end up with this, where it's glued. But make sure when you're gluing, you're only gluing the seam area. If you accidentally get glue on the outer seam area, then when you go to iron, you're going to have to kind of take it and pull it a little bit so that it will release the glue. Another tip that I have about gluing is when you're gluing the extra sections together, they're basically like this to start out with. If you take and you just pull that tab back and you put a little bit of glue just on the one side, then you can come back and put it together, and you kind of keep the glue to the seam line. And once I get the stick glue on there, I try and even them up. And then I hold my fingers on it for a couple seconds, and voila, there you go. All right, so when I cut these out, I took and, like I showed you earlier, I drew the different templates, and I added the extra things on the ones that I drew. Then I came back and I cut them out. And as you can see, there's extra on the upper template versus the lower template. That has to do with the seam allowance. But there is a way to get that done without using templates, but using this ruler. And I learned it from a video on YouTube. So I'm going to have the YouTube video displayed below, the link to it, so you can get to that video anytime you want to. But generally, the way she did it was whatever size you're using as far as the ruler, then you're going to cut this one 1 inch smaller than this one. And you're going to trim off 1/2 inch. As you can see here, there's about 1/2 inch from the ends of the upper piece. But watch her video, it's very enlightening. The way I figured out for our pattern what to use to be able to have a template to give you all and to have use this ruler so I could cut these out quicker was I put the template on the ruler. 9.5 is where this comes closest. And then we're going to use 8.5 to trim the other portion. And I'm going to show you how to do that. The reason I made 7.5-inch blocks is because they're what will give me the least amount of waste. And the way I figured that out was I did take the templates and put them on here and measured it out. And you can see it does give you the least amount of waste. The only waste we're going to have is this, this, and this. Here's how you do it with the ruler. For a quarter circle on this ruler, you match up the seam line here and the fabric. So I now have this line on the fabric line. And I had said I'm going to use the 9.5. I'm going to put my hand in front of the line that I'm cutting. And then I'm going to get my rotary cutter in the slot. And I'm pushing down with my palm on the end. And I'm coming all the way around to the other side. Now, you can also put your hand behind. And maybe I should have done it that way, but I'm a little restricted with the camera. Then when you come back, you have your inner circle made, your lower piece made. Now, I didn't want to waste this, so what you have to do after that is you come back and you take your ruler, your square, and I started out with a 7.5 inch. So I'm going to have to take this back 1/2 inch to 7 inch. So here's my 7 inch and here's my corner. I'm going to make sure it's on the inside of the fabric. And I'm going to trim off that 1/2 inch. So now I have those two little pieces that are garbage. Then I come back with this ruler again, and I match up the side line with the piece so that they both are right on the edge of the piece. And I hold it and I trim in the 8.5 inch. And that gives me the other side. Now, obviously, we can't put this one with this one. So let's get a cream one. And I'll repeat the pattern for you so you can see. Matching up the lines where it says 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then cutting the 9.5 inch slot. Now I have my other circle. Taking my other ruler, cutting 1/2 inch off of my 7.5 inch, which I'm putting the 7 on the corner. Coming back with the ruler, matching up again, the 1/4 inch seam allowance lines onto my piece, lining up my 1/4 inch seam on here, and then trimming the 8.5 inch. Now I have both color and background cut, and I can swap them. Okay, so now you've got your non-glued piece together and all your easements cut in. And we have our glue basted with easements cut in. And I really like putting in this sew line. It really helps me not to have to worry about if I'm getting 1/4 inch away from the edge. And it really gives me an exact amount that I can cut down to when I'm making my easements. So when you sew the non-glued one together, one trick is to try and get the line as straight as possible as you're sewing your line down. I'm using an open toe so you can see myself sewing this line. You can use a closed foot. Remember to take your pins out as you sew. A little trick for that is you can have a magnetic pin catcher so that over in the corner while you're sewing, you can just put them there. Don't have to worry about stitching them anywhere else. And sew on your line. And of course, I'm not doing what I told you to do. Make sure you take your pins out. I hit a pin last night practicing this, getting ready for it. With my open toe, I have to adjust mine a little bit more than you'll have to if you don't have the open toe. But try and pull that line straight as you're sewing it. As you can see, got a lot of pins to play with when you do the pinning method. Yes, it saves you the time of gluing it together and the mess, because it is a little bit messy. I'm trying to keep my hands out of your way, so I know you'd be able to do this a little bit more smoothly than I can. Every so often, adjust yourself to get the line straight and pulling your excess fabric out of the way. Adjust first, then you can pull your pins out. And it does a good job. Here's how it goes with the glue one. And as you can see, I used a chalk marker on this dark fabric. And I'm using a cream colored thread so you guys can see easier. And No pins to clean up. Once I iron it down, it's nice and flat. Looks great. To the ironing board. I would like these to be flat as can be. So you can go in the opposite direction, but as you can see already, the quarter circle is already laying flat pretty good. So I'm going to just use the fabric the way it is. It doesn't really matter if these seams are one way or another. They're not matching up in the quilt when they're sewn together. So we don't have to make them lay a certain way to nest them into anything. So you can do them from the back. And I pull a little bit on the corners. This is the one that doesn't have the glue. And then when you bring it to the front, there you go with that one. Here's the glue one. I'm going to give it just a little yank all the way around just to make sure there isn't any glue in that outside of the seam. And I'm going to give it a nice iron here. Now, the one thing you can do is you can give more easements here. And if you do, this is going to lay a lot flatter. So I would suggest you go back and nip the extra easements in between. This is a curve. The better the easements are, the more curve you're going to get. This is a pretty sharp curve. Less sharp curves don't need as much easement. This is 1/4 of a full circle. So when you do that, and you iron on this side, gives you a pretty nice circle there too. Today, it just happens that this one looks better than that one. And it might just be because the cream's on the outside versus the cream on the inside. Okay, I promised you one more way. And this is, I'm thinking, would be good to use if you have odd curves and you needed to create a seam line that wasn't easily drawn, or for a full circle, this would be a good way to make a seam line for yourself to use. And then you could use a top stitch method to inset your circle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go away from my ironing board, and I'm going to use my garbage can, and I'm going to take spray starch, and I'm just going to give it a gentle squirt so that I get some spray starch on it. It's a little wet. And I'm going to come back to my ironing table. And to let you know, this is the one that I did a lot of easement marks in. It just makes it easier if there's a lot of easement marks. So then I take a cardboard cutout without the seam allowance, and I match it to the corner and the back line. Now it's showing a seam that I can iron back. And first I'm going to come back and I'm going to use my fingers. If you left a lot hanging off over here instead of having just the seam amount, and the way I learned this was from a video, and I will put the link down in the bottom of this video so that you can go to that video and watch it. It was a demo and it was a little longer, but she did not cut her seam allowance like I do. She didn't use templates like this. She just basically had a piece, then had a cardboard piece that she wanted to mimic. And she had a long area of fabric on this side. So once you get those bent, if you take your iron and you gently iron those tabs over without burning your fingers, and hold it there for a minute, you then have a perfect seam bent backwards, and you can then top stitch if you want to. Your seam into place, matching up these edges to these edges, pinning it down, and then sewing it. And that's another way to make curves quick and know that they're accurate, because that is a perfect quarter circle. All right, I showed you about the steam, I showed you about the starch method. And here's another simple thing you could do. Instead of opening it up and using the seam that's there, you could just top stitch it. And obviously I would have put more pins in there and had them facing outward so that this would lay a lot flatter. But that's another thought. Is a top stitch one. Make sure you pin all the way around. I used thread that you can't see that it's top stitched, but it is top stitched. And my suggestion is with these, always make them a little bigger than what you need and trim them down. It doesn't matter if all the curves are in the exact place. The pattern on the quilt will not show these if they're off, if they're not exactly the same size.